the crew a $15,000 bonus. And my friend turned to me and said, Nick, if we had all the meth in the world, we couldn't have finished that house in 3 weeks. And I thought, that seems like a fabulous idea for a book. But unlike my previous books, for some reason I just couldn't really picture setting it in rural Wisconsin. I can't tell you why I felt that way, but it just didn't seem right. So I held on to this story of all the meth in the world for probably 4 years. And then almost every fall, my family and I take a trip out west. We fly into Denver, we rent an RV, and then we go to various national parks within like 1,000-mile distance of Denver. So we drove up to Yellowstone, and on our way back towards Denver, we dipped into Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I was pretty naive at the time. I thought, what a quaint little ski town. You know, if things in Eau Claire don't work out, maybe we could come back here at some point in our lives and settle down. And then I started looking at Zillow listings for real estate in Jackson, and I couldn't believe the prices. I think at that time, back in 2017, 2018, the lowest house on the market was half of a duplex that you'd immediately rip down, and it was like $900,000 or something crazy for like a one-bedroom duplex. So I began thinking like, well, how do people live in a community like Jackson? You know, how do normal people raise their kids in a place like that? How do they buy a house? How do they settle down? Anyway, we got our pastries and coffee from Jackson, and we were driving 45 miles southeast of Jackson to the Bridger-Teton National Forest, where we were going to camp for a number of days because there were some hot springs there. And we set up camp, and every day we'd hike up this long kind of winding gravel road to these hot springs. We'd pay our admission fee, and then I'd sit there, and I was looking at the mountainsides and this deep valley and the river there and the hot springs, and I thought, well, what if this book was set here? What if this wasn't public land? What if this was private land? What if instead of a $2 million house south of Eau Claire, it's a $20 million house outside of Jackson, Wyoming? And instead of like a 3-week deadline, what if the crew was given more like a 5-month deadline? And what if instead of making the responsible decision to not use crystal meth to stay up all the time, the guys were actually put in a position where they had to use crystal meth to complete the deadline? I also began asking myself questions like, why did the homeowner have this crazy deadline? What was her motivation? And where did her money come from? Who has that kind of money to pay every subcontractor on a job $15,000? So I realized that the house, or both the house and the book, needed to be set in Wyoming. Also where roads close because of heavy snow. So if this is a ticking clock sort of thriller, there's not only the deadline that the homeowner has imposed, there's the deadline that the mountains and the weather is going to impose as well. I also put myself on the same sort of deadline as the characters in the book. Little Faith, I think, came out in 2019, and I really believe super strongly in that book. So I, aside from the tour that my publisher was putting me on, I financed a lot of my own touring, visited like 56 cities, not only around the US, but also in Europe. But I was also writing this book in every spare moment that I had, picking kids up from school or staying in a hotel or eating dinner or whatever I did. I just had this very like anxious, sweaty, like we're gonna get this thing done in 5 months, sort of tact for writing the novel. And I think it turned out really well. I'm really proud of the book. I think it's got something to say about how the middle class is shrinking in America. Communities like, a Jackson Hole, where increasingly the middle class is just being pushed out, and also about like happiness and success in America. So I'll read a short chapter from the book, and then I can take questions. This is chapter 13. There's not a whole lot that you need to know for the setup, except that the three main characters, who are the owners of this fledgling construction company, True Triangle, that they're the ones that have been chosen by the homeowner to sort of complete construction of this crazy expensive house out in the countryside. But it's important for you to know that the house was already under construction when they got the job, which is very odd. The following day, the men were gathered in the garage eating their lunches, a light rain falling outside, when they watched with curiosity as a sheriff's truck pulled across the bridge up the driveway and parked 20 paces away from the house. "Now what the hell is this about?" Bart asked in a low voice. "Beats me," Cole said. "I ain't done anything wrong. How about you, Teddy?" "No way. Never had so much as a speeding ticket in my life. Anyway, I don't think I've done anything wrong," Teddy said, a hint of guilt in his voice. "I mean, I hope not." The sheriff stepped out of the truck, and a moment later, a fellow in his early 30s opened the passenger door and climbed out into the drizzle. "Afternoon," said the sheriff. The men stood and wiped their hands on their pants, on pieces of paper towel. "Oh, I don't mean to bother you none. This here feller just forgot a tool, and given the stipulations of that NDA your boss had him sign, he felt like it was the proper thing to have an escort up here. I don't blame him." "Sure as hell glad to be done with this place," the man said. "A tool?" Cole said softly. "Any of you guys see a Milwaukee cordless drill and 2 batteries? The sheriff called out. "Yeah," Bart said. "Funny you should ask. We got it right here. Wondered who left such a nice tool up here." He stood from the pile of lumber he'd been sitting on, and after retrieving a small cardboard box, he handed it to the man. "Hey," Cole said, "maybe, if you wouldn't mind, is there any possibility you could tell us what happened here? Why you fellows had to walk off the job?" The man scoffed. "What is this, a trick? I tell you what happened, and you scabs go back and tell her and get our deals ixnayed? No dice, assholes. I appreciate you keeping my drill safe, but I ain't spilling no beans." And with that, he tipped a dusty baseball hat in their direction and climbed back into the truck. Then the door opened again, and the man climbed out, leaning against the truck. "Actually," the man said, "I'll say this much. I don't envy you some bitches one bit. You're doing the devil's work, and you don't even know it." And with that, he slammed the door. "Gentlemen," the sheriff said, turning his back to them and walking to his truck. "Wait a minute," Cole said. "That fellow might have signed an NDA, but you haven't. Clue us in, Sheriff. Don't you think we got a right to know?" The officer stopped, turned on his heels, and looked back at the house for a long time before addressing Cole. "You fellers really don't know, do you?" They shook their heads in the negative. "A worker died here," the sheriff began. "They was working round the clock, and a feller was up on them top I-beams after dark and toppled off." The lawman made a motion with his hand like a bird falling out of the sky and then hitting ground. "Broke his back in multiple places. He was more or less dead on impact, skull fracture, massive bleeding. I came out the following day to talk to witnesses, but it didn't much matter. No one was directly responsible. We ruled it an accident, a stupid preventable accident. Wasn't like anyone could press charges, so there's nothing on the record. I guess your boss talked to the man's family and paid off the rest of the crew for their silence." "Where'd he fall?" Teddy asked. "Over yonder," the sheriff said, pointing near the hot springs. "Son of a bitch," Bart said. "Son of a bitch." "You boys be careful," the sheriff warned. "That man died because he was being worked. The word around the campfire was that he hadn't slept in 3 days. Now, good day to you." They watched the sheriff's truck reverse and then pull back down the road. "You gonna call her?" Bart asked Cole, "or should I?" "Oh, I'll call her," Cole said. "I say we call her right now." They piled into Cole's truck, all 3 of them, and rode out to the highway where the cell reception was good enough for Cole's phone to find a signal. He dialed Gretchen's number and then turned the phone's speaker on for all to listen. "Cole," she said warmly enough, "what news from Wyoming?" He laughed darkly and looked at his friends. "What news, Gretchen?" "Well, a little bird just told us what went down at your house before we were hired on. You got any comment on that? Any comment on working a man until he fucking died?" There was a brief pause, and the men looked at one another and out the rain-slicked windshield as a logging truck rushed by on the highway. "That man," Gretchen said, was notoriously non-compliant with standard safety protocol. He didn't care to, for example, wear a helmet, and the day he died, he was not strapped into a harness, which would have certainly saved his life. He was also known to begin drinking at 5 in the evening, whether he was done working or not. He fell about 20 feet away from his last can of Steel Reserve. Not that it really matters, but I also examined his criminal records, where I discovered that he had been arrested for 3 incidences of drunken driving and 2 instances of not paying child support. Those details are not necessarily germane to the question you are asking, but they illustrate that this man was no saint. So, Mr. McCourt, would you like to rephrase your question? The men stared at one another, the cab of the truck filled with a strange combination of dread, remorse, and anger. Well, a little honesty would have been appreciated, Cole said. We don't care for being called scabs, ma'am, and it does make a little more sense now why that crew walked off the job such as they did. One of their guys died, and from what we heard, he'd been working for days on end. Am I on speakerphone? Gretchen asked coolly. You are, Cole said. It's me, Bart, and Teddy. Good. Gentlemen, you've been offered an opportunity to change your own lives and the fortunes of your family. Don't find excuses to fail. Just do your jobs. Do your jobs, and the cosmos will smile upon you. I promise. The men knew not what to do with this advice. It was not what they had expected her to say. Now then, if you'll excuse me, I have another call, she said. Good day. They heard her hang up and then stared at one another, each offering deep exhales. What about that mug who died? Bart asked. The cosmos sure as shit didn't smile on him. So yeah, these guys kind of walk on to a half-built house site, and I think they get a 5-month deadline to finish it. And things are going along pretty well, but then several events happen that really threaten the timeline. So I would say when I was thinking about how to write this book, which is kind of more like a literary thriller and not something that I'd ever tried to write before, I was thinking about books like A Simple Plan by Scott Smith or In the Lake of the Woods by Tim O'Brien. And I was thinking about the way that I was also thinking about Treasure of the Sierra Madre by B. Traven. And I was thinking about how much I like a good morality tale where characters could always make the right moral or ethical decision, but never do. They know what the right decision is, but for one reason or another, mostly because of money, they never make it. So what the reader comes to understand by reading Godspeed is they know that something bad is going to happen. They know that something bad is going to happen to certain characters, but they just don't know when, where, why, or how. So that's sort of the trick of making it into a page turner. It's like you have a sense of dread. You just don't know when it's going to happen. And I think maybe I'll read one more short chapter, and then we can talk, or we can stare at each other awkwardly. So one thing that I thought has been really interesting about this book and the American real estate market over the course of the last probably 12 years, but in a white-hot way the last maybe 3-4 years, is the ways that middle-class people are being priced out of communities that they would want to live in. Some good friends of mine had their house burned down outside of Eau Claire, and they had good insurance, so they got a pretty sizable 6-figure check. And this was their opportunity to move really anywhere that they wanted. So they both like to hunt, so they were looking at Missoula, Montana. And the husband went out to Missoula for 3-4 weeks to scope out real estate. He found a house, nothing crazy, like a very middle-class house, and put in an offer and found out that he was one of 4 parties bidding on this house. And his agent said, you're going to have to come up with another 50 grand if you, 50 grand over asking if you think you're going to even be considered. Well, it turned out that the house sold for something like 150 over asking. So they got frustrated. They kept trying to get into Missoula. Same thing happened. House after house, they were being outbid by tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars as people from California are moving to Montana. So they started looking closer to home, and they were looking in the Bayfield area and found a house up there, made an offer, and the real estate agent said, there's another offer on the table, and they're willing to go, much more. So what are you prepared to do? So they said they would go $75,000 over asking for, a very nice house, but a middle class kind of American house. Turned out that the house sold for like $100,000 over asking. It was bought by a private equity firm, which is probably going to turn it into an Airbnb. So I didn't know about examples like that when I was writing this book, but that was already percolating a little bit in the zeitgeist, and this chapter's about something similar. So again, there's three principles to this small construction company. There's Cole, who's sort of the most even-keeled, responsible of them. He's like a member of the local chamber of commerce, and he's trying to build the company. There's Bart, who's kind of like, he's totally irresponsible. He's into drugs. He doesn't have a family. And he's kind of looking at this project as his last sort of project because his knees are failing him and he just needs to get out of construction. And then the third primary character is Teddy, who is Mormon. He's married. He's got 4 daughters. And he really wants to build a life in Jackson. So this chapter describes a little bit about that. Brittany led Teddy from house to house, each one more overpriced than the last. A 3-bedroom for $750,000 in need of a new furnace, a new roof, a kitchen that would have to be completely remodeled, and a radical overhaul of at least one bathroom carpeted in dandelion yellow shag circa 1976. Every time he pointed to something that was hopelessly outdated, broken, or hastily and only impermanently repaired, she scoffed, folding her arms defensively across her chest. But that's the thing, Teddy. You can do all those things. We don't have to pay to fix those things. All he wanted to do was sleep or work at his own leisurely pace on Gretchen's house, perhaps roll onto the work site around noon and kick off at 5. That would seem like a vacation. Now they stood inside a nondescript 1960s-era Rambler, and the sound of Brittany's voice commingled with the real estate agent's, a white noise he ignored as he stared out into the backyard, pretending to imagine some future fire pit or the herb garden Brittany was always talking about. Isn't it great, Brittany asked? Some TLC, some elbow grease, a little attention to the curb appeal, and we can turn this place around. I mean, the bones are good, right? He absent-mindedly rapped his knuckles against some faux wood paneling, the hollow sound that returned to his ears betraying a lack of insulation. He imagined exorbitant winter heating bills, especially since the girls complained anytime he turned the thermostat below their requisite 75 degrees. Yeah, he said, great bones. And honestly, the real estate agent said, a prodigious keychain dangling off her index finger, the price is right. You just can't get into this market for any less than this. It is an impossibility at this point. Trust me. Teddy stared hard at the agent, a woman in her 50s with a Jane Fonda aerobics body, platinum blonde hair, and the ridiculous name of Shelley Winterbottom. We've looked at 12 houses, honey, Brittany said, and I really think this is the one. This has to be the one, don't you think? But the only house he could think about was Gretchen's out there in the mountains, the hot springs steaming up into the blue late autumn sky, the last of the yellow cottonwood leaves falling into the river, the house's sleek lines and beautifully wide windows staring out, searching for the builders, looking for him. Brittany was standing beside him, then holding his arm gently in both of her hands. Teddy, she whispered, I know you're tired, baby, but help me out here. This is so important. If we don't make an offer, this house could be gone by tomorrow or even tonight. We don't have time to hem and haw. Winterbottom made a point of looking at her watch. Tell you what, she said, her heels clicking loudly on the wood floors in all that unoccupied space. I'm going to be at the office the rest of this afternoon and evening until 6. If you want to write up an offer, just shoot me a text and I'll get your paperwork started. Okay? After escorting them out of the house, they shook hands all around, and the agent drove off in a black Audi R8, leaving the Smiths on the driveway, both with their arms crossed and rather troubled looks on their faces. "Teddy," Brittany began, "where's your hat at?" He didn't even know where to begin. Perhaps by explaining that working on Gretchen's house had pretty much ruined him for any other house, or that he found this endless tour of the town's less than desirable real estate to be something of a death march, that everything about this property they now stood upon depressed him, that he could spend the next 20 years remodeling and troubleshooting this house, and it would never approach even a fraction of the beauty of Gretchen's house. Not its quality of materials, not its breathtaking vistas, not the time and thought that had gone into every inch of those blueprints. He thought of Gretchen's kitchen, of the deep sink that would soon be installed, and the beautiful farmhouse faucet, of the Wolf range and Sub-Zero appliances, of the hood so powerful it could practically suck a sparrow out of the kitchen and up into the mountain air, of the giant island of Italian marble and the skillfully made cabinets, the granite countertops, and that was just the kitchen, never mind the fireplace, the space-age mechanicals, the solar array and the geothermal heating, the triple-glazed, ultra-efficient windows, and all of that was before he even got to the really troubling stuff, to the subject of Bart, or their deadline, or the fact that December was no longer very far away. He reached for her hand. "I really like this house," he said at last, looking into her eyes. I think it's the one. You're right." He could see her heart leap, could see her eyes brighten and her shoulders rise before she came to him, kissing him hard and squeezing him with all her might, smothering him with happiness. "Oh, Teddy, you really think so?" He smiled. "I do," he said. "This is it. It feels right." "Oh, baby," she purred. Finally, we have ourselves a home." She snapped out her phone and shot a text to Winterbottom before they'd even crawled into the car. A few blocks down the road, Brittany directed him down a new cul-de-sac, no houses yet built, and only after she told him to park the car did he understand. Just as she pulled down her underwear and moved over to his side to straddle him, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to forget everything, felt her hand freeing his belt and then her hand on him, and he pushed into her and felt an incredible relief and a sort of healing, and they kissed, and then, just before she was finished, she arched her back backward, pressing into the steering wheel and the horn, and both of them collapsing into giggles because he thought, "Fuck it, it's just money. That's all it is. I'll just work harder." They drove on to the agent's office holding hands. Teddy glanced over at his wife to see her wipe away several tears. You all right?" he asked, pulling the car to the side of the road. "Baby?" No, she said, smiling through tears and laughing. "You don't have to stop. Please keep going. What's wrong?" "I'm just so happy," she explained, new trails of mascara now streaking down her cheeks. "I'm just so excited, Teddy. It's all." He couldn't help grinning as he pressed down on the accelerator. They had scratched and saved for years, but these past few months, with all the work on Gretchen's house, they had just enough for a down payment. Of course, Teddy's heart had fairly stopped when they talked to the bank and calculated their monthly mortgage payments. The debt they were assuming was colossal. But if they could finish Gretchen's house on time, the bonus would go a long way toward paying off the principal. But without it, for the first time he understood that this town did not want people like him and his family. As laborers, yes, but could they just please live as far out of sight as possible, or better yet, strive for invisibility altogether? This town did not want rusted old minivans on driveways, plastic toys in the front yard, or loud music and smoky charcoal grills, true towny bars, or mom-and-pop greasy spoons. No, everything was becoming polished and perfectly clean. The town wanted houses like this to be razed, torn down, and rebuilt 5 times larger. A few of his ranch hand friends never even came into town anymore. They'd come to hate the looks they got for chewing tobacco, smoking a Marlboro, or ordering a Bud Light. And yet, he felt a growing wave of excitement at the notion of becoming a homeowner. All right, the place wasn't perfect, but Brittany was right. Bart and Cole would gladly help him out. And starting with the roof, they could work their way down, got the kitchen and bathrooms first, then finished the basement. Maybe the girls would even pitch in, help paint the house, have the opportunity to know the pride in improving something. Heck, in 10 years, maybe they could flip the house for double what they'd paid and start a new project, maybe even get some acreage outside of town. Whenever he thought about the mortgage, his chest tightened. So he put that out of mind. America is the greatest country in the world, his father always used to tell him, as long as you don't run out of money. Now those words rang in his head. The only solution was to work harder, harder, and harder still. If he hadn't already been committed to that deadline, he sure as heck was now. Teddy held the door for Brittany as they walked into the agent's office, a small street-level space with brick walls and wide Doug-fir flooring. As soon as Shelley Winterbottom saw the Smiths, she held out a hand as if to stop them, perhaps, or warn them, and then showily pantomimed zipping her lips shut. It appeared Winterbottom was in conversation with someone over the speakerphone. Well, you'd be stupid to take that offer, she said rather loudly, a cross look etched across her face. My buyers are pre-approved and can make a down payment as early as tomorrow morning. They're a beautiful family with 4 young girls in the local school system. Yeah? A man's voice boomed out from the phone set. Well, look here, Shell, because I got another buyer who will pay $50 more than asking with a cash deposit tonight. Winterbottom shot them both cold looks and yanked the receiver off its cradle. Teddy and Brittany sat down heavily in 2 chairs opposite her. After some time, she said, all right, yep, okay, just hang on, all right, Royce? She sighed, pressed her thumb and forefinger against the bridge of her nose. I hate to say I told you so, she began, but if we just made an offer on this house yesterday, or even 4 hours ago, what's the matter? Teddy said, where do we stand? Another offer came in simultaneous to yours, and the seller's agent says this other party will go 50 more than asking. Well, wait a minute, what do you mean simultaneous to our offer? How's that even possible? One of the offers must have come in first. I mean, why would they pay 50 more if their offer was first? Winterbottom shrugged. That's what the seller's agent is telling me. The question is, can you go another 75 grand higher? No, Teddy said. No, that isn't the question. The question is who was first. The question is what is right. We texted you immediately. Couldn't have been 5 minutes after you left. There's got to be timestamps on those emails. When did you put in our offer? Now it was Winterbottom's turn to stare coldly at Teddy. Let me call you right back, okay, Royce? She said, hanging up the telephone and exhaling loudly. She then reached into a desk drawer and appeared to pop a piece of Nicorette into her mouth. Mr. Smith, what would you prefer I do? Impugn Royce Hollister's integrity and destroy my relationship with him, and in doing so muddy your name, your wife's, and by the way, the good name of your construction business? Or would you like me to call my friend Royce back and tell him we're willing to go another 75 over asking, or if you're serious, a full 100, and that you'll get him a cashier's check tonight, or at the very least no later than tomorrow morning? Because those are really your 2 choices here. $100,000? Brittany asked, her voice a tremble. But that's... How many times had Teddy lost? How many times had some customer belittled him, talked down to him, skipped a payment, or argued an invoice? How many times had some tenant in some shitty apartment talked to him like he was a servant? How many years had he struggled to keep food on the table, to buy new clothes for the girls, to occasionally splurge on Brittany? Never before had he complained or even expected anything. And now he could see that the house was lost, and he sighed deeply. Without turning to look at Brittany, he took her hand and could feel her body racking with what he knew was a different sort of crying, a different kind of tears. Teddy knew his own limitations, knew he wasn't as smart or clever as Cole or as strong and relentless as Bart, and yet surveying his future in this town, he knew that he would need Winterbottom, knew he'd need her to sell houses they might build in the future, knew he'd need Royce Hollister too, knew that these real estate agents had last names as recognizable as the area mountains or rivers dominating the local maps. Heck, in a few cases, the creeks and basins carried their names. These were people he'd need as friendly business acquaintances for the next 3 or 4 decades. He was in no position to make an enemy here, let alone 2 of them. And so he glanced down at his boots, rubbed at the stubble of his head, squeezed Brittany's hand, then slowly stood. He wanted very badly to pick up Winterbottom's desk and in one heroic moment of defiance send that bulky furniture through the office's expensive front window. That was what the heroes on his dream board would have done, but instead he offered Winterbottom a tightly apologetic smile, squeezed his wife's shoulder, and just said quietly, "Let's go." Brittany did not so much as look at the agent, nor did she say goodnight or waste any time with any of the pleasantries Teddy was so accustomed to hearing her chirp out at people. She simply moved slowly toward the front door, leaving him there beside their agent's desk. "I'll keep you posted," Winterbottom said. "Look, sometimes things fall through. We wrote a good, clean offer. Sometimes you just get bested, especially in this market. Anyhow, we'll be in touch." Right, Teddy murmured. "Good night, then." Out in the car, Brittany came fully apart. Teddy hadn't seen her so disappointed in many years, and he did his best to comfort her. "It wasn't meant to be, I guess," he said quietly. "And I'll tell you something, Britt, that house is a money pit. It would have been a boondoggle, baby. We would have paid way too much to begin with. Who knows, we may have just dodged a real bullet." "I want more," she said at last. "I want us to build something. I don't want to just keep renting. Our parents own their houses. Why can't we?" "We will," he said, kissing the top of her head. "We will." He dearly hoped that his words weren't empty, that they could complete Gretchen's house on time, that Gretchen was true to her word, and that he would have the stamina to finish the job, to stand there on Christmas morning and receive his award like some kneeling knight waiting for the shoulder kiss of a ceremonial sword. But the closer they moved toward that impossible goal, the more the whole deal felt like a cursed bargain. Even this town had begun to feel like a mirage, an illusion of what once was possible in America rather than what it was, a Tony playground for the richest of the planet's rich. Thank you. So, maybe somebody's got a question. If not, then I'm happy to just go ahead and sign books if you'd like. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was kind of about my process, like after I got the initial idea for the book, how do I then move forward? I knew basically what the reader knows going into the book. I knew that these guys were going to have a deadline. I had to do a little bit of mapping out to figure out, like, okay, well, when did they come onto the job site? This house had been built before they came onto the job site, and then there was this accident and everybody quit, so they kind of inherit a partially built house. So I figured, well, they had started in the spring of that year, so maybe they're taking over late summer, and they've got to get this thing finished before the snow really flies. Because it's a work of fiction, I thought, look, probably this road would be closed by early December, it being Wyoming. But I say in the book that it had been a very dry, warm year. So I said Christmas will be our deadline. So it was kind of nice because I had a deadline, like a contained timeline for the whole book to happen. All my books, I don't plan it this way, but all my books tend to be about male friendship. So I had this idea of a small construction company, and I wanted to have 3 characters, 3 male buddies, each different from each other, and I wanted them to hopefully develop as characters. So that was one thing. Like in the beginning, the characters are different than the end. Then I had to spend some time thinking about the homeowner. Who was this person? Where did her wealth come from? Why is she building the house where she was? So I had those basic kind of questions in my head and the structure of the timeline, and then I just started writing. And I knew that something bad was going to happen to the characters, but I didn't really know what. And the one thing about writing a thriller, especially like a ticking clock sort of thriller, is that it's kind of fun to write. You're just you're kind of like a reader. You're making stuff up as you go along, and I really, really enjoyed writing this book. I probably won't write another thriller for a little while because I have other projects that I want to pursue, but I really enjoyed writing it. But I think to answer your question in a broad sort of way, I don't do a terrible amount of mapping out or anything like that. I tend to do more like mapping out after I've gotten into the book, and then make sure that like my timeline makes sense. You know what I mean? Yeah. Yes. I think mostly I'm working it through as I write. Not every book has followed the same sort of methodology for writing. Like Shotgun Love Songs was written totally out of sequence. I had 5 main characters, first-person narration. So oftentimes I was just writing chapters, again, totally out of sequence, saving them on my computer. At the time I was writing it, I was at the Iowa Writers Workshop. A small benefit of which was that we had the capability to print whatever we wanted. So I was constantly printing out these new chapters out of sequence, and then I'd lay them down on my dining room table and be like, okay, we've got a narrative going here. I can see how it's arcing, but we need a chapter here. So then I'd go back and write that chapter. Especially the last 2 novels that I've written have had fairly simple plot structures in that they're moving forward pretty much straight through time, straightforward, like an arrow, with maybe like 1 or 2 chapters telling some sort of backstory. So, yeah, pretty much I'm just figuring it out as I go. After I finished Godspeed, my editor, Sally, said, I understand why she built this house where she did. It's obviously in a very beautiful part of Wyoming. That makes sense. But she thought that there should be another reason why the house is being built where it is. So actually I had to go back, read the whole novel, which after you've reread your own novel 50 times, you're really, if you have a healthy ego, you're sick and tired of the book, right? I went back and read it, and I thought, that's very good advice. There should be some other reason linking her to this place. So I went back and wrote a whole chapter that happens in the middle of the book. And I think it's the only backstory in the whole book, but it's the key, kind of the emotional touchstone or key to the book. And that was great advice. So that's one example where I wasn't, something found its way into the book that was not part of my normal writing process. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I do enjoy, well, first off, when I started writing, like in my late 20s, I never could have conceived that I would be doing it as a living, So I think I had kind of a romantic notion of what my writing life would be. I thought I'd just be a short story writer, I thought there was like something pure about that. Over time, I think I've really begun to like the challenge of writing a novel. It's really hard to complete a novel, but I find that like the emotional mysteries and surprises in a novel are so rewarding to me to write, to like fully understand a character, or to write about something that's troubling me in my own life within the context of a novel, and then feel like I understand more about my own life, or maybe a person in my life who, it's not like I'm modeling a character after a real life person all the time, but sometimes I'll, like for example with Little Faith, much of the main character was modeled after my father-in-law, who's a man I love so much and look up to a lot. And he's led a very beautiful but at times disappointing and tragic life. But if he was sitting here, he's like so positive and kind, and so many people depend on him. And I always thought, how is that possible? How does he conduct his life with such positivity and energy after all these disappointments? And so that book was sort of a way for me to figure that out, which is something I feel so fortunate that that's my work, that I get to just puzzle over the questions in my life and puzzle over the people that I love and admire, and that work gets put into these books. Yeah, right now I'm working on a sequel to my first book, Shotgun Lovesongs. The action takes place like 10 years after Shotgun Lovesongs happened. And primarily the action is between Henry's wife Beth, and Lee, the sort of rock star character of the book, and the way that their lives have changed, and the issues that they're going through. Lee's career was white hot in Shotgun Lovesongs, but 10 years later it's not so white hot. He's going through like disappointment and trying to understand where he's going with his career. And Henry's, who's a farmer, and I think never really questioned never questioned his job or his role as a farmer. He's getting kind of tired, worn down. He's never made any money, and he's considering whether he should continue farming or not. So it's been really fun to write, because it's just Shotgun Lovesongs, I had no expectations for what was going to happen with that book, and it did really, really well. And a lot of people are still discovering it. And it was translated into like 11 or 12 languages. The film rights were bought. And I think because I'm from the Midwest, I'm not very good about talking about the things that I do well. Like, that's not something as Midwesterners we do. We don't brag about ourselves. But the thing that book did really successfully is that it's emotionally honest. And it is emotional, too. It talks about love and friendship and marriage and hometowns in a way that I think is unusual. And I think that's the reason it was so popular. So I've always wanted to go back to those characters, but I didn't want to do it in a way that was anything less than what the first book did right. And so, but I think I'm back there, and it's been really fulfilling to be working on it. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for coming out. I'm happy to sign your book if you'd like, but I sure appreciate it. Drizzly day outside and the Badgers are playing, so I appreciate it. Thank you.